list of transactions here in my Google Sheet. And the columns I have here are, so I have columns A and B, they're blank. This is where I'm going to be doing my work today. Column A, I have the word random ID. Column B is concatenated ID, so those two columns are blank. Column C, I have a bunch of dates. Column D is customer ID, so it looks like a unique list of customers. Column E is it says SKU underscore category, so some kind of overarching category for the SKU of my products. And then column F is the actual SKU, so that's just a bunch of unique characters. Column G is quantity, column H is sales underscore amount. So essentially it's a list of transactions from a bunch of different customers, and it goes from row 1 down to row 1001. So I have 1,000 rows of data. The actual data set is actually much larger than this, but I'm just taking a sample of 1,000 rows. And our job is to generate a unique ID for each transaction. If you're looking at the Google Sheet right now, I have basically a bunch of dates, customers, SKU categories, and SKUs, quantity, and sales amounts. And I wonder, and if someone wants to look into what is the actual, let's say, sale amount for this customer and this SKU, you probably want to have a unique identifier to identify that specific transaction in this list of transactions. So I'm going to walk through a few different methods on how you can basically create a unique IDs for your dataset. And this, to a certain extent, is how you can kind of create a random list of numbers or random list of IDs. But the important thing to remember here is that you want each individual row of data to have a unique identifier that's completely unique for the whole table of data. Right now, I have a few rows that are duplicates where I have the same date, same customer ID, same SKU underscore category, same SKU. Maybe the quantity and sales amounts are different. Those two columns are probably what I'm going to be putting into a pivot table, but let's take a look here at what I can do. So the first one is to create a sequential number of IDs, and I'm going to do this in column A. So the first thing I'm going to do is in column I, I'm going to write just like this numbers, and I'm just going to create a formula where I just take the first row as number 1, and then for cell I3, which is right below where I typed number 1, I'm going to write equals I2 plus 1. And then you notice how Google Sheets says suggested autofill, press Command Enter to fill the formula down. Let's see what happens if I do that. And you see how it just automatically creates 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 all the way down to the bottom of my table, down to row 1001. But row 1001 is actually transaction number 1000 in my data set. If I go back to cell A2 now, I'm going to write equals double quote tx dash double quote ampersand, and then move over to the cell reference of I2, and then I'm going to drag this formula all the way down. And you notice now I have every single row now has a specific unique ID where it says tx dash and then the number. So it's tx-5, tx-8. And the great thing about this is that every single row now has a unique identifier. And so if I want to know, well, what was the sales amount for transaction number 150, tx-150, you can see what that is by looking at that specific row with that identifier. The reason why I put the tx in front of the dash, or the tx in front of the number, is because sometimes you want your unique identifier to like have some kind of abbreviation for you to know what type of data this is. TX is just kind of like my shorthand for transactions. Now the important thing to note here is that I just kind of randomly created this transaction number to act as the unique ID. This unique identifier is not going to be useful for any other tables that are related to this list of transactions. Maybe there's like an orders table, or maybe there is a customers table where I need to know, or I need to associate rather the transaction with that customer or the transaction with the order. I have to make sure that if this is the ultimate transaction ID I use, it has to also be reflected in other tables of data. But this is probably the fastest and simplest way to create a simple unique ID for your data set without having to do a whole lot of kind of formula work. Now, the second method is one method I like to use when I need to have something a little more, dare I say, unique in this example. So I'm going to go back to cell I2, and I'm going to write the formula equals round, left parentheses, rand, which is the rand function. So I get a random number between 0 and 1. Multiply that by, let's say, 100,000, and then comma 0 for the round. And notice how my formula kind of changed randomly here to just be incremented by 1. I'm just going to drag this formula down. And now I have kind of somewhat random numbers, 5 to 6 digit numbers in my column I. So now if I go back to column cell A2, I can write equals double quote tx dash double quote ampersand and go to this random number I generated. And I can drag this down. And now you can see I have a bunch of random numbers, and it makes each transaction row feel a little more unique. It's not just a sequential 1 through 1000. This might be a little easier to manage if you have a bunch of transactions that you need to quickly name, and you know that the list of transactions is not going to be increasing or decreasing very often. With the previous method, if you have new data being added to your list of transactions, you're constantly going to the bottom of the table and then adding new transactions from 1000 to 1001, 1002. This way it just feels a little more random and, in my opinion, a little more unique. And you can, of course, add more digits to this random number. In my case, I just use rand, the rand function, multiplied by 1,000,000. So this is one way of doing it. Now, the problem is what happens if one of these so-called random numbers is duplicated in my list. Even though I'm using the rand function, there is still a small chance that out of these 1000 rows, one of these numbers is duplicated. Now, I'm not going to go into how you can create random numbers that are not duplicated across the entire list, but there are a bunch of formula hacks you can use to basically get a super unique list of random numbers. I'm not going to do that here. The other problem with this method is that every time you, let's say, go into a cell, hit enter, or actually, let's see here, if you just refresh if you just refresh or type anything inside one of the empty cells, Google Sheets automatically recalculates that random number, and that means your random numbers are not going to stay consistent in column A because it's based on a formula in column I. So what you actually have to do is copy these numbers from cell in column A, because these are formulas, copy them, do a paste values somewhere over here to the right in your empty column, paste special values, and then you copy these numbers back over to your random ID column. And notice how here, now these are all hard-coded numbers and not formulaic based on what on this rand formula I created in column I. So this method plus the previous method requires you to do a little bit of kind of copy paste, kind of just tedious work, which isn't ideal. But again, if you have a list of transactions, in this case that's not changing too often, this could be doable for your job. The problem is now you have to still look to see if there are any duplicate values in this list of transactions because we're using a random list of numbers. The final thing I want to mention about doing a random number like this is that you really have to think about your data set and what it's meant to represent. This looks like it's a sequential list of transactions. We don't have a specific timestamp, but my guess is that there's probably a timestamp associated with this date, and this is probably a sequential list of transactions as they're happening, like on this day or over a few days. And so typically in this scenario, if it's a list of transactions that's happening over a period of time, the transaction ID probably should be sequential. That's how this typically works in most databases, is where as the new transaction happens from the store or whatever, you get a new transaction ID that's just one plus the previous row that was added. So again, this is something you have to think about in terms of how you want your, or rather you have to think about what type of data you're working with and finding a unique ID that's like suitable for that data set. Now, the final method, which I like to use sometimes for certain cases, is doing the concatenated ID in column B. And what that means is we take different columns from our data set and add them together to form kind of a unique ID that is kind of unique, but could also run into problems. And I'll show you what that means. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine columns D, E, and F, concatenate them together to create the unique ID in column B. So let's say in B2, I'm going to write equals D2, which contains my customer ID. I'm actually going to put a dash in between all my cell references. So I'm going to say D2 ampersand, double quote, dash, double quote, ampersand, SKU category, and then add another double quote, dash, double quote, and then add my final unique identifier, which is the SKU in column F, hit enter, and I'm just going to do the autofill here that Google Sheets suggests. And you notice here how my concatenate ID is, it looks unique, but all it really is just adding together the customer ID, the SKU category, and the SKU columns together. And it creates a unique ID where it consists of all these three columns. So this looks like a unique ID, but you also, again, have to check to see if there's any duplicates. So what I can do is go to Data, create a filter, and I'm going to insert a blank column between columns B and C. And I'm going to write in column C, count greater than 1. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look to see if the concatenated ID, if there are more than one copies of it in this column B, because we don't know how many of these. Maybe the adding together customer ID, SKU category, and SKU is not really as unique as we think. So I'm going to write equals count if, and then I'm going to say B2 to B1001, make this absolute reference, count if the value equals B2. And I'm not sure why this is a date, but let's change this format to a number. Where is the number format? Here we go. Okay, well, let's remove the decimal places. Let's drag this down. And I already can see here that most of these are ones because there's only one account of one of these IDs in my whole list, but let's take a look to see if there's any twos. Let's filter this column to only the twos, hit OK. And you can see here that I have 8 transactions where the combination of customer ID, SKU category, and SKU, even though adding those 3 columns may make the transaction unique, these 8 transactions show that there's a few transactions where these 3 columns are exactly the same multiple times. So what does this mean for making a unique ID? Well, it means I have to add another column to my unique identifier to make this ID even more unique. Perhaps I can add the sales amount and the quantity. At this point, I'm just basically adding every single column for my data set. But you can see here, even for sales amount, these 2 sales, they might be duplicate sales. They look like they are, but it's the same exact sale amount, $6.07. And this is where you really have to do some special data cleaning and data cleansing to see what is the actual, well, first of all, is there duplicate data in my data set? And second of all, what can I additionally add to my unique identifier to make this more unique? I could say double quote and dash double quote to the sales amount, and now I have the number added to the end of my transaction ID. Now this is probably not what you want to do because now you're mixing in metrics from the actual table into your unique identifier. I don't want to have like my actual sales number in my unique ID column. But if I don't have any other way to make this a unique ID, then I kind of have to do some extra things here to make it look more unique. So this is where you might even start hard coding some data, which I highly advise against. But this is where the concatenate ID column, concatenate ID, unique ID falls apart a little bit. So let's get rid of this column, this count column that I use just to figure out if there's multiple numbers. And let's get rid of my filter. So those are the three different methods for creating unique IDs in your dataset. The reason why I kind of like having this concatenate ID is because if I just take a look at this transaction ID, without perhaps you're looking at imagine like columns C through I were all hidden and you couldn't see the day, customer ID, whatever. Just by looking at the transaction ID, you can see like who the customer is, what the SKU category is, what the SKU is, and it's all kind of compact within that column, which can make working with your data more easy in the future when you know like, okay, customer ID 5852 in row 123. I know that this customer is important, and as long as I see that customer ID in the concatenated ID column, then I should just make a mental note to remember this that this row is important, and maybe I'll highlight this row differently, maybe make this like a light blue or something, just so I know that this is like a special row. Just some ideas to think about when you're using the concatenate ID. Additionally, you can also use this with creating summary stats. So let's say I have a summary table here to my right, just kind of making this up on the fly. Let's say I have let's say I want E7 POD as a SKU here, C3R9E. And what I can do is I can say, well, if I want to find the sales amounts for all SKUs that have EZ POD or C3R9E, I can write equals sum if, and then array formula, left parentheses, right, and just take the right 5 values of this, and then say if it matches up with this cell, the SKU I'm interested in, and then I think I do the actual sum range, which is this. Make this opposite reference. And actually, I think this, I didn't do this right formula right. This actually has to be the entire column. Did I do this right? I think this is right. Basically, sums up any sum amount that has this specific SKU. And the reason why I had to do the array formula is because I want to look at the right 5 characters of my concatenate ID and basically see if it matches up with this cell. You could also ask yourself, why don't I just do like a sum if using the actual columns themselves? Again, sometimes you may not have these columns readily available to you, so using these concatenate IDs is just kind of a shorthand, a short workaround to be able to access the specific values for that unique ID. These are just 3 methods I've used in the past. Now, there's probably a bunch of other different ways you can create unique IDs for your data set.